magazine innocent of slander. Just think for a minute about what that means. The magazine had written that, quote, Hunt was in Dallas the day the president was murdered and was involved in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, unquote. The jury said publicly that they found that what the magazine had written about Hunt was true. Essentially, they found Hunt guilty of the murder of President Kennedy. Somehow, that story failed to make the papers. But there's at least one story from this trial that should be told. During the trial, the former head of CIA, Richard Helms, testified that Marita Lorenz was a CIA agent known to him and working for them. Her role in a CIA plot to assassinate Castro was the plot of a movie. During the court proceedings, Ms. Lorenz testified that she was part of the CIA's Operation 40, which carried out terrorist raids against Cuba from 1960 to 1963. During November of 1963, she was working with this man, CIA operative Frank Sturgis. She testified that one day Sturgis came and told her to pack her bags, that they were going on a mission. A short time later, she drove to a motel in Dallas with Sturgis in 2 station wagons full of men and guns. There was a knock at the door, and E. Howard Hunt came in and began passing out maps and money. This was clearly shaping up as an attack not upon Cuba, but upon Americans on American soil. Lorenz told Sturgis, "I'm getting the hell out of here," and took a cab to the airport and flew back to Miami. The next day, President Kennedy was murdered. Sturgis returned later saying, "You should have been there. We made history. You missed the really big one. We killed the president." Again, after listening to all the testimony in the trial, the jury found that Spotlight magazine did not slander Hunt when Spotlight printed an article saying that Hunt had murdered John Kennedy. But Hunt did not have the ability to steal the body from the Dallas coroner, or to steal it again from the Secret Service, and remove it from its coffin, and mutilate it, and then return it without attracting public attention, and he didn't have the ability to get all the media to lie about it.
In all these years, there has not been a single piece of credible evidence to prove a conspiracy.
For the next 40 years. The theft of the body, for example, could only have been carried out by the most powerful devils in the world. Devils so powerful, we would recognize their names if we heard them. Can we connect Hunt to any major league devils? Former President Richard Nixon might be a good place to start. Even though he's not generally regarded as an expert at handling guns, he is portrayed in popular American culture as being a slave to the devil. Nixon chose E. Howard Hunt to lead his private White House goon squad, the so-called Plumbers Unit. Hunt became famous as the head of the Watergate burglars. But after his arrest for breaking into the Watergate Hotel, while he was sitting in jail, Hunt suddenly began sending messages to Nixon that he needed $2 million to keep his mouth shut. At the same time, Hunt started talking to reporters, saying that he was a CIA assassin. To the thousands of people who believed that the CIA had killed Kennedy, this was earth-shaking news. Hunt was threatening to tell about the Kennedy assassination if Nixon didn't get him the hell out of jail and get him $2 million. Nixon sent word to the FBI director that he had to stop investigating Hunt's activities in Mexico. Nixon said that the FBI investigation would threaten to uncover the whole Bay of Pigs thing. The whole Bay of Pigs thing? What is that supposed to mean? Bob Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff and closest advisor. He wrote, "It seems that in all those references to the Bay of Pigs, he was actually referring to the Kennedy assassination." Nixon was forced to resign based upon the single charge that he tried to stop the FBI from investigating Hunt. And, according to Haldeman, Nixon told the FBI that investigating Hunt would uncover the whole Kennedy assassination thing. But how did Nixon know that Hunt was involved? And if he did know, why did he hire him? And why should Nixon care what Hunt said or what the FBI found out about the Kennedy assassination unless he was involved? Was Nixon involved in the Kennedy assassination? One of the most stunning revelations to be uncovered about Nixon recently is this little gem. It seems that Jack Ruby, the mafia thug who shot Oswald, who was spotted by a Dallas reporter in Parkland Hospital in the area where the magic bullet was found on the wrong stretcher, was working for Congressman Richard Nixon in 1947. Nixon admits that he was in Dallas the day that Kennedy was murdered. It also seems that Nixon, like Hunt, can't remember how he heard the news that Kennedy was murdered. You see, in 1964, he told Reader's Digest that a man ran over from the street corner and said that the president had just been shot in Dallas. However, exactly 9 years later, he told Esquire magazine, a woman came out of her house screaming and crying, "She told me that John Kennedy had just been shot in Dallas." Why does Nixon remember two different versions of how he found out that Kennedy was dead? Perhaps, like Hunt, he can't tell the truth about where he was and what he was doing. But Nixon wasn't a powerful devil in 1963. In fact, he had quit politics completely after losing the election in 1960 to Kennedy and then losing the election for governor of California in '62. So he was taking orders in 1963, the day Kennedy was shot, from much bigger devils. Can we name them? During World War II, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was given the job to investigate the activities of American Nazis. In the course of this work, he investigated the Nazi connections of Union Bank of New York, and in 1942, the year the U.S. entered the war, the bank was seized as a Nazi asset. Prescott Bush, the grandfather of little George Bush, was the director and executive officer of that bank. And when the U.S. grabbed the bank, he protested. He said, "Wait a minute, that's my bank." Hoover said, "That's right, no mistake, you're a Nazi, you run a Nazi bank." Now, let's not exaggerate. You run a bank for the Nazis, they tell you what to do, you do it. Does that make you a Nazi? Just because you follow their orders? Well, yes, it kind of does, doesn't it? And besides, Prescott didn't live in Germany, he lived in America. He had a choice. There were lots of other jobs and other people he could have worked for. He freely chose to work for these Nazis. But maybe the Germans he was working for were just opportunistic businessmen, you know, just out to make a buck. Well, no doubt they were out to make a buck, but the principal German business partner in the Union Bank was the most infamous Nazi financier, Fritz Thyssen, an early enthusiastic and vitally important supporter of Hitler's, providing key money in the earliest days of the party. He is probably the most important financial supporter of Hitler's that we know about. So Hoover knew what he was talking about. Prescott Bush was a Nazi's Nazi. This is going to be extremely important later on, so please make a note to yourself. Hoover knew that the Bushes were Nazis. Yeah, enough with the Bush bashing. What does any of this have to do with the Kennedy assassination? Well, Prescott Bush, little George Bush's grandfather, was a co-director of this Nazi bank with this Nazi, Averell Harriman, his boss. Prescott Bush was also a full partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. They were the closest of business associates. Remember the trial of E. Howard Hunt, where the jury found Hunt guilty of the murder of President Kennedy? During this trial, Hunt testified that immediately after World War II, he was in Paris, working directly for Averell Harriman, reporting directly on a daily basis to his boss. Now, ask yourself, how likely is it that two of Harriman's closest business associates never met each other, never had anything to do with each other? It's possible, but it's not likely. So there's a connection, 2 degrees of separation, between little George's grandfather and an established Kennedy assassin. We saw a moment ago that in 1942, Hoover forced Prescott Bush to give up his active political support for his favorite young politician, Adolf Hitler. However, 4 short years later, Prescott found another young man to sponsor in politics, Nixon, who was documented as employing Jack Ruby a year after this photo was taken. Nixon, who hired Hunt, was created and sponsored from the very beginning by Prescott Bush. Now, you look at this picture. Do these two look like equals, or does one look like the boss and the other look like the servant? Despite his near arrest as a Nazi a few years before, in this picture, Prescott was now a senator. That's juice. And with his help, Richard Nixon, the poor grocer's son, had become vice president. But not for long, remember. He was about to lose to Kennedy. Now, you remember, we posed the problem a minute ago that, while circumstantial evidence powerfully suggests that Nixon was involved somehow in the Kennedy assassination, the circumstantial evidence does not suggest that Nixon was a powerful devil in 1963 when Kennedy was murdered. He was just one of a multitude of puppets, Secret Service men, FBI, CIA operatives, who participated in the assassination, all relatively powerless, getting their strings pulled. And we wondered, who was pulling Nixon's strings? Perhaps now we have an insight into who was pulling Nixon's strings. So, what do you think of the case so far? We've established Hunt as a first-level supervisor of the assassins. He is connected to Prescott Bush through Harriman. And he is also connected to Prescott through Nixon. It will probably surprise you to learn that very early on, many key people knew that the CIA, through its Cuban and Mafia operatives, had killed the president. It was not a very well-kept secret. Just one example is that Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Haynes Johnson says that he was in the room when Robert Kennedy, on the afternoon of the murder, blamed the assassination on the CIA and their anti-Castro Cubans. And there's reason to think that Hoover also knew most of the details of the assassination even before it happened. In 1960, 3 years before the assassination, Hoover himself wrote a memo about Lee Harvey Oswald's involvement with the CIA. 3 years before the assassination, Oswald was on Hoover's personal radar as being CIA involved. Just amazing. And apparently just the beginning of a long and beautiful relationship between Hoover and Oswald. You see, at the opening session of the Warren Commission's official investigation into the Kennedy assassination, this man, the Attorney General of the state of Texas, Wagoner Carr, calls up the commissioners and says he thinks, "Y'all ought to know your boy Lee Oswald was working for the FBI on the payroll getting $200 a month with the ID number S179. The commissioners decided not to even ask Hoover about it. Why? My guess is they were scared to death he might admit his relationship with Oswald. And there's powerful evidence that Oswald was working for the FBI, spying for them on the CIA. In 1963, Kennedy called in Hoover and ordered him to locate the secret training camps that the CIA was using to train their anti-Castro Cubans for terrorist raids against Cuba. He didn't want another missile crisis. The camps were so secret not even the president knew the location. But Kennedy ordered Hoover to find them and to shut them down. And Delphine Roberts, a secretary who helped run the CIA's camp at Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana, told the Warren Commission she saw Lee Harvey Oswald at the camp just days before the FBI raided it and seized all the weapons and shut it down. Oswald's closest known associate in New Orleans worked at this garage where Oswald used to hang out with him. This witness told the Warren Commission he saw Oswald exchange envelopes outside the garage with men he took to be FBI agents. And you remember Sophia Lorenz. She says Oswald was at the meeting in Dallas the day before the assassination when Hunt walked in and started passing out maps and money. William Walters, a clerk at the FBI, produced a memo from Hoover warning of a coming assassination attempt on November 22nd in Dallas. Hoover knew.
These people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
And if Oswald was his informant, he knew